You do not fear a march. For centuries, marching is the simplest thing an army does. One foot, then the other. A road, a destination, the promise that movement equals control. You can fight a battle, you can survive a bombardment, you can even endure captivity. Because in every one of those, there is at least a shape to the danger. It has a boundary, a front line, a horizon. And in the German mind, especially in the final winter of the Second World War, there is another rule. Retreat is still in operation, even when the Reich is cracking. Even when fuel is gone and trains are bombed and maps are lies, the order to move west sounds like the last remaining form of discipline. You evacuate camps, you clear roads, you keep prisoners from falling into enemy hands. You preserve what you can. So the command papers call it a transfer, a relocation, a march to the rear. It sounds almost administrative, but there is a truth soldiers learn too late. The road can kill you more quietly than any weapon. The road does not need bullets. It needs only cold, hunger, and time. And in January 1945, as the Soviet army surges forward and the German state begins to fold in on itself, the march stops being movement. It becomes a trap. Not because someone planned it that way from the beginning, though rumors will claim exactly that, but because once you step onto that frozen road, there is no safe place left to step off. You can feel the rules shatter in a single sentence that keeps appearing in different forms from different mouths. There is little shelter, little food, no medical care. Men collapse, and then comes the turn. Because in 1945, one winter march, one vast, disorganized westward drag of human bodies, forces even the most hardened observers to admit something unthinkable. This is not an operation anymore. This is brutality with a timetable. You are not a prisoner. That matters, because it changes what you are allowed to see. Your name is Albert A. Cadler, and you move through this collapsing world as a Swiss Red Cross observer. Neutral on paper, but not neutral to suffering. You are there to watch conditions, to report what the camps are doing, what the guards are doing, what the prisoners are enduring. You write what you can, when you can, because you know the war is ending and the paperwork is about to become a weapon. Proof, denial, memory, prosecution. By late January 1945, the Eastern Front is no longer a line. It is a flood. The Germans begin forcing Allied prisoners of war westward, away from the advancing Soviet army, in extreme winter conditions for months, January to April, across Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. From the total of 257,000 Western Allied POWs held in German camps, more than 80,000 are forced onto the roads. There are many names for what is happening. The Great March West, the Long March, the Black March, the Bread March. Survivors, when they speak later, often strip all that away and call it something simpler. The March. The strategic reason looks clean in ink. Evacuate the camps so the prisoners are not liberated by the Soviets. Move them to the rear, keep them under guard, maintain bargaining chips, avoid chaos. The German leadership can even claim a legal rationale to remove prisoners from a combat zone as long as it does not put their lives in greater danger. But legality does not warm a man at minus 20 degrees Celsius. Paper does not feed a column when Red Cross parcels run out. An order does not become a blanket. And you, Cadler, begin to understand something else. When a state collapses, it does not collapse evenly. The top still issues commands. The middle still pretends it can execute them. The bottom, guards, civilians, prisoners, live inside the gap between must and can. Now you walk into that gap. One of the most notorious evacuations is from Stalag Luft 3 Beske, a camp in Sagan, today Żagań in Poland, known already to the world for the Great Escape a year earlier. On 27th January 1945, that camp is evacuated as Soviet forces advance. This is where your report becomes a spine the story can hang on. You record numbers, you record distances, you record temperature. You record what happens when 2,300 men are told to march in bitter winter with inadequate shelter. The first day is not even the worst day. It's the day that teaches the lesson. They go to Freiwaldau, about 26 kilometers from Sagan. There is accommodation for a third of them. That means 2/3 spend the night outside. Outside in winter, that is especially harsh, with heavy snowfall, ice, and sub-zero temperatures day and night. Think about what that implies. 2/3 of 2,300 is over 1,500 men. That is more than a regiment of human beings lying down on frozen ground and learning immediately that there is no rear area anymore. And then the next day you just write the number that turns a march into a verdict. Minus 20 degrees Celsius. They march again toward Moscow, another 35 kilometers away, in strong winds with a few breaks. And this is just one column, one slice of a far larger movement of prisoners and refugees. You know what the German assumption is. They assume the march is hard, yes, but survivable. They assume the men will arrive. They assume discipline will hold. But now you see the truth. Build, step by step. In this winter, the road is not a path. It is a filter, and the weak do not pass through. The context narrows into a single challenge that waits for every man who joins the column. How do you stay alive when the only order is to keep moving? You step onto the road, and immediately the march begins to erase the difference between prisoner and walking corpse. The men form up in groups, often 250 to 300 at a time. That is not an aesthetic decision. It is what the roads can handle, what the guards can manage, what chaos forces into shape. And even then, the groups do not follow a single clean route. They scatter across an enormous area, zigzagging, circling, sometimes ending where they started, because the front lines shift faster than the orders. Now the pace sets in. 20 kilometers, 30, 40. The sources describe 20 to 40 kilometers a day. That is 12 to 25 miles on feet already damaged by years of poor rations and inadequate shoes. They rest wherever they can, factories, churches, barns, sometimes in the open. You want a picture you can feel? Imagine a column moving through snow with the sound of 1,000 souls. Not boots, not always. Sometimes rags, sometimes wood. Sometimes nothing but numb feet that do not report pain anymore, because pain is a luxury of warmth. The air is sharp enough to cut your throat. Your breath freezes at the edge of your scarf. When the wind hits your wet clothing, it turns it into bate, armor, cold, stiff, and heavy. And in that cold, everything becomes a decision with a cost. Do you keep your boots on at night to avoid your feet swelling until you cannot put them back on? If you keep them on, you risk trench foot. If you take them off, the boots might freeze solid, or someone might steal them, or your swollen feet might refuse to fit by morning. Frostbite waits either way, and then the hunger arrives as predictable as dusk. The Red Cross parcels issued before the march soon run out. After that, rations are meager, distributed by Germans who are themselves running out of everything. Men begin scavenging, not because they are criminals, because calories are now a weapon, and they are unarmed. The body changes first, cheeks hollow, eyes sink, fingers crack. The line between cold and injury disappears because cold becomes an injury. And then the diseases begin to move through the column the way fire moves through dry grass. Contaminated water leads to dysentery and diarrhea. In one report, a Red Cross delegate later estimates that 80% of POWs on the Northern Line suffered dysentery. Think about that number. 8 out of 10 men. 8 out of 10 men trying to march 20 to 40 kilometers a day while their bodies empty themselves and cannot replace the fluid. Now add humiliation. Some soil themselves while marching and cannot stop. There is no privacy, no clean clothing, no soap, no rest. If you fall out of line, you risk being left behind. If you leave the road to squat, you risk getting lost, or shot, or frozen. So you keep moving. You keep moving because movement is the only thing the guards measure. And the guards, this is where the brutality becomes unstable, are not all the same. Sometimes they provide farm wagons for those who cannot walk. But there are seldom horses, so teams of POWs pull the wagons through snow. Think about that. Starving men harnessed to the dead weight of other starving men because the state cannot even supply an animal. Sometimes guards and prisoners depend on each other. Sometimes the guards grow hostile as panic spreads. The same uniform can mean a thrown crust of bread in one village and a rifle butt in the next. And then there are civilians. In some villages, residents throw bricks and stones at the passing men. In others, they share their last food. The march does not move through a world of clear morality. It moves through a world of scarcity, fear, and exhaustion. All the while, another danger stalks the road from above. Allied fighter aircraft roam German-occupied territory and sometimes mistake long rows of marching men for German troops. That means the sky, your supposed promise of liberation, can become another threat. Now you need to feel the trap in its purest form, because the trap is not a fence. It is a calendar. January, February, March. The winter of 1944 to 45 is especially harsh. The sources describe heavy snowfall, ice, and sub-zero temperatures day and night through January and February. Even into mid-March, temperatures remain below freezing in many places. That means the march is not a few bad days. It is 4 months of attrition. And the German command's original assumption that trains will transport prisoners collides with reality. Rail lines are disrupted, fuel is scarce, the front is moving, and the roads become the only remaining conveyor belt. So men walk. They walk until walking becomes the whole war. You, Cadler, record a slice of it. 2,300 men from Stalag Luft 3. They covered 26 kilometers to Freiwaldau on the first day. Then 35 kilometers to Moscow in winds at -20. They sleep with inadequate shelter. And the march ends, in your account, at Nürnberg-Langwasser on the 4th of February. But that is only one evacuation. Elsewhere, other columns go even farther. One notorious trek from Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania forces POWs to march about 800 kilometers in blizzard conditions, and hundreds die. Other marches cover 1,079 kilometers over just over 3 months, with meager rations and cruelty. Some men will have marched over 800 kilometers by liberation, some nearly 1,500 kilometers. Now imagine what that distance does to a body already weakened by captivity. You do not need a bullet to make a man die. You can simply measure out the kilometers, because the march becomes an equation. Distance plus cold, plus hunger, plus disease equals collapse. And collapse on this road is not a pause. Collapse is a sentence. Some who cannot go on are shot by guards. Some freeze to death in their sleep. Some get frostbite that turns to gangrene. Typhus risks spreading through lice in crowded, reused shelters. You can hear it, coughing that never stops. The wet sound of boots in slush. The occasional crack of a rifle in the distance that everyone pretends not to notice because noticing changes nothing. Now the story tightens around a single moment because this video title promises a realization. So here is the realization, the one that hits German soldiers in the same winter, even if the suffering on this march falls primarily on POWs and other displaced people. The realization is that winter does not care who you are. German soldiers, guards, and retreating units are trapped in the same environment of collapse, broken transport, frozen roads, shortages, and a front that moves faster than planning. They may still hold rifles and authority, but that authority cannot conjure bread. It cannot conjure shelter for 2,300 men on a night when only a third can fit indoors. It cannot conjure medical care when dysentery runs through columns. And there is another realization, darker, sharper. Once you begin forcing people to march under these conditions, you cannot control what it becomes, because each kilometer adds not only exhaustion, but resentment. Now the march starts producing its own momentum. Rumors spread among POWs about why they are being moved. Some fear they are being marched to death. Others fear they will be held hostage. Others fear a last redoubt in the Alps. German authorities may claim duty, but the road teaches prisoners to expect the worst, because the worst is already happening. And somewhere in that churn of rumor and frost, discipline cracks. In one account from another march, a private dies of dysentery and malnutrition while waiting for hospital admission for at least a week. The German authorities do not allow burial. The men are compelled to carry the body into a garage and leave it there. Stop and consider what kind of world produces that sentence. A world where even death cannot slow the schedule. And it is here that the Winter March reveals its true nature. It is not merely suffering, it is the machinery of a collapsing regime still attempting to exert control through movement, moving bodies like cargo, while losing the capacity to keep those bodies alive. Now, we need a countdown, a moment-by-moment sequence where you can feel failure closing in. So you return to that second day of Cadler's report, the day that carries the number -20. You are in the column, not as a historian, not as a reader, as a man with lungs that burn. You step out before sunrise because guards want distance covered while the snow is firm. The wind hits your face and your skin tightens immediately. Your eyelashes collect frost. Someone near you coughs, and the cough sounds like cloth tearing. The pace starts slow, then steadies. You count in your head because counting gives you something the Germans cannot take. Structure. 35 kilometers to Moscow. You try to break it down. 5 kilometers, 10, 15. But the cold plays tricks. The horizon never arrives. When you stop, even briefly, the sweat in your clothes chills you faster than the wind. So you keep moving even when your legs begin to feel like someone else's legs. Now men begin to fall out. One sits down because he believes he will stand back up. He does not. A guard shouts. The man tries to rise. His hands shake. He cannot make his knees lock. The column moves around him because a column is a river. It does not stop for a stone. You look away because looking does not help. You keep moving because the only alternative is to become the stone. The line stretches. You begin to see the trap's geometry. You cannot speed up enough to end it, and you cannot slow down enough to survive it. When night comes, there is no guarantee of shelter. Sometimes you reach barns or churches. Sometimes you sleep in the open. If you are lucky, you squeeze into a corner that blocks the wind. If you are unlucky, the wind uses your body as a landmark. And this is where failure seems certain, because the cold does not negotiate. Your stomach cramps, not with hunger alone, but with the body's attempt to shrink inward to save heat. Your mouth tastes of metal. Your lips split. You begin to imagine warmth the way a drowning man imagines air. Now you face the most terrible decision on the march: sleep. Sleep is necessary. Sleep is also dangerous. Some men freeze to death in their sleep, so you lie down and you fight the natural pull of unconsciousness because you are afraid that if you let go, you will not return. Men press together because bodies become the last remaining resource. You can hear teeth chattering like small tools striking each other. Morning arrives with no mercy. You stand, and your boots, if you still have boots, feel like foreign objects. You try to move your toes. You do not know if they move. Then, again, 20 kilometers, 30, 40. The march becomes a loop of suffering broken only by rumors. Liberation is near, the Americans are coming, the Russians are close, the guards will shoot everyone. The guards will run. And in the background, the war's end approaches like a door that will not open fast enough. Now, at roughly the middle of this story, you reach a revelation that reframes everything. The German state is not only marching prisoners west, it is also filling the roads with refugees, hundreds of thousands of civilians moving in the same direction, away from the Soviet advance. Women, children, old men pushing carts, pulling sleds, carrying bundles that become heavier each hour. The roads clog, the march slows, and in that congestion, the guard's authority weakens further because you cannot command a blizzard and a traffic jam at the same time. Everything that could have made the evacuation survivable, transport, planning, shelter, supplies, has already been consumed by defeat. That is the trap. The order to west assumes a functioning system waiting at the other end. But there is no system. There is only more road. And now, after that revelation, you earn the pause. If you find this kind of forgotten history as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of courage and sacrifice deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help us ensure they aren't forgotten. Now the march continues and it grows stranger as winter loosens its grip. You might think thaw brings relief. In one sense, it does. The worst of the cold eases. Some guards become less harsh. But the thaw brings its own cruelty. It turns roads into mud. It ruins improvised sledges prisoners made to carry scraps of clothing and saved food. Items get discarded because a starving man cannot carry memories and survive. The route becomes littered with coats and blankets, with objects that look like abandonment but are really strategy. Lighten the body to save the heart. And still the fear remains, because some columns are marched toward the Baltic Sea amid rumors of using POWs as human shields and hostages. You can feel what that does to a prisoner's mind. Even when spring appears, you do not trust it. Even when the sound of artillery shifts, you do not know if it means rescue or rerouting. Then, suddenly, the war's end collides with the column. Western Allied armies advance. Some groups are liberated as they run into those forces. Others are still being pushed, still being dragged along, as if the act of marching itself has become the last remaining proof that the guards still matter. And above, the danger from air attack does not vanish just because liberation is near. On April 19th, 1945, at a village called Gress, a column of Allied POWs is strafed. 30 die and 30 are seriously injured. Even the liberating side can become lethal when the road looks like an enemy retreat. Now picture the final days. The column's shape changes. Some guards melt away, some remain, stiff with fear of punishment. Prisoners begin to sense the moment when authority becomes theater, and then, for some, the trap finally opens. Liberation arrives, sometimes in a rush, sometimes in a whisper. But the road has already taken its payment. The true impact of the Winter March would not be understood until the counting began. Because the march is not one event. It is a series of forced marches during the final stage of the war in Europe, driven by evacuation orders as the Soviet army advanced. Over about 4 months, from January to April 1945, more than 80,000 Western Allied POWs are forced westward under extreme winter conditions. What they didn't know, what German planners could not fully control, was how quickly a logistical decision could become a humanitarian catastrophe. The sources describe columns wandering with little or nothing in the way of food, clothing, shelter, or medical care. Disease spreads, frostbite cripples, and men die not only from violence but from exposure, starvation, and illness. And then the ripple extends beyond the road. After the war, Germans are investigated and prosecuted for offenses, including ill treatment that resulted in deaths, and the Long March appears in those records as evidence of conditions and cruelty. The event becomes part of a broader reckoning over war crimes and the treatment of prisoners. Even in the immediate aftermath, the movement of people continues in a different direction. On the 4th of May, 1945, RAF Bomber Command begins Operation Exodus, repatriating prisoners by air. Over 23 days, it flies 2,900 sorties and carries 72,500 POWs. Think of the contrast, from a road that kills through weeks of walking to aircraft that lift men out of the ruins in hours. But the psychological impact lasts longer than the flights, because the march exposes the final truth of a collapsing regime. When a state loses the ability to supply, it often tries to compensate with control. It issues orders to move bodies, to delay liberation, to preserve bargaining power. Yet, the only real result is that the powerless pay the price in blood, ice, and distance. And for German soldiers and guards who believed move west meant survival, the winter teaches its own lesson. Retreat is not safety when the world behind you has already fallen apart. Now return to the human scale, because history is not cold numbers unless we let it be. In your notes, Cadler, you wrote of 2,300 men marching out from Stalag Luft, 3 in late January 1945, covering 26 kilometers the first day, and then 35 kilometers the next in minus 20 degrees Celsius winds, with only a third finding shelter that first night. Those numbers are not abstractions. They are bodies. Men who can count each kilometer because each kilometer hurts. And the names that surface from these marches remind you that this story is not a metaphor. Private Lowson, POW number 16,929, dies on the 15th of April, 1945 of dysentery and malnutrition while waiting for hospital admission. Another man, Lance Corporal Gordon Pollitt of the King's Regiment, dies on the Long March from Stalag B. His record states he dies as a result of a shooting incident involving an SS officer, and he is 40 years old. 40, not a boy, a full life behind him, and then this road. To this day, the march is remembered under many names: the Great March West, the Long Walk, the Black March, the Bread March, because survivors tried to label something that felt too large to hold in one phrase. But the most haunting name remains the simplest: the March. It matters now because it warns you how quickly routine wartime decisions, evacuate, relocate, move west, can become death when logistics collapse and cruelty fills the gaps. It matters because the end of a war is often imagined as relief. Yet, for tens of thousands, the end arrives as the longest, coldest stretch of road they ever walk. And it matters because remembering is not passive. It is an act. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this piece of history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state and tell us if someone in your family served. Thank you for ensuring that Albert A. Cadler's account and the thousands of men forced onto those winter roads do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.